My wife had just given birth to our daughter, and while I held her hand in the hospital, my parents abandoned our 6-year-old son at a church just because I refused to give my younger brother $50,000. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about the moment I realized blood isn't always family. And what I did next changed everything. If you've ever been guilted, gaslit, or forced to choose between peace and your dignity, stay with me. You need to hear how this ends. Welcome to our channel where real stories come to life with heart depth and meaning. Thank you for clicking on this video and spending your time with us. I invite you to stay until the very end because today's story isn't just emotional, it might just change the way you think about love, family, and what it means to truly belong. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family that belonged on a postcard. I was Daniel Miller, 33, systems engineer, 2-story home in suburban Atlanta, a grill in the backyard, a swing set for our 6-year-old son Caleb. My wife Emily was a nurse with warm hands and a soft voice. She'd just entered her 8th month of pregnancy with our second child. We'd picked out the name already, Sophie. Every evening was a slice of peace. Caleb would run to the door as soon as I stepped in, shouting "Daddy" with arms open wide. Emily would be in the kitchen, hair pulled up, belly rounding, humming a lullaby to herself while stirring something on the stove. It felt like everything I had ever worked for was right here, small, simple, and sacred. My parents, Walter and Elaine, visited often. They adored Caleb, at least it looked that way. Elaine brought old picture books from my childhood and read them aloud in the same tone she once used on me. Walter built Caleb a birdhouse in our backyard. He even taught him how to throw a football, something he never had time for when I was growing up. But even then, there were cracks in the frame. "Daniel, don't spoil him too much," Walter once said when Caleb was crying over a scraped knee. "A boy's got to learn not to cry over every bump." Elaine would laugh it off and redirect. "Oh, Walter, let the boy be little," she'd say sweetly. But the softness in her voice felt performative, the way you smooth a tablecloth over a stained table. Then came Ryan. 4 years younger than me, my brother Ryan had always been the one who needed saving. As kids, he got the good birthday gifts, the extra servings at dinner, the attention when he failed, and the praise when he succeeded, no matter how small. When I was 14, I asked to join my school's soccer team. "Too expensive," Walter said, flatly. Yet when Ryan wanted piano lessons at age 10, they hired a private teacher who charged $60 an hour. "He's gifted," Elaine had explained, beaming as if Ryan had just been accepted into Juilliard. Even as adults, the dynamic never changed. 4 years ago, Ryan came to me with a bright-eyed pitch for a European-style cafe in downtown Atlanta. I listened, nodded, and handed him $8,000 money Emily and I had been saving for a new car. "You're helping your brother get on his feet," Walter told me. "That's what family does." The cafe folded in 6 months. Ryan never paid me back. Now it was Caleb's 6th birthday. The backyard was filled with balloons, folding chairs, and the smell of grilled burgers. Emily had baked a dinosaur-themed cake, and Caleb ran from guest to guest with frosting on his cheeks. It should have been a perfect day. Then Walter arrived, clapping Ryan on the back and calling him the future businessman of the family. Elaine handed him a gift bag and said, "This one's from Uncle Ryan." He picked it himself. It was a remote control car, something I had said no to a week earlier because we'd already bought Caleb enough toys. Ryan smiled and said, "Uncle knows best." The car made Caleb scream with joy. Emily gave me a tight, knowing look, but didn't say a word. Later, while everyone was still laughing and nibbling on cake, Walter pulled me aside. "You should learn a thing or two from your brother," he said, sipping from a red Solo cup. "Takes risks, isn't afraid to follow his passion." I blinked. "You mean the failed cafe or the photography gig? Or when he sold sneakers online for 3 months? Walter shrugged. "He's still young. You were born to be steady. Ryan was born to try." That's when I realized in their eyes, I was the base of the ladder. Ryan was the one allowed to climb. Emily found me sitting alone at the edge of the patio that night, my hand wrapped around a flat soda. She kissed the top of my head. They don't see it, she whispered. But I do. Caleb ran past us with his new toy, laughing like the world was perfect. And I smiled, because for him it was. But for me, the illusion was cracking. The people who were supposed to love fairly had never once done so. And yet, I had kept showing up, kept paying, kept smiling. I was the dutiful son who traded dignity for peace, the one who handed over money and silence in equal measure. I watched my father ruffle Ryan's hair and call him Kiddo, the same nickname I hadn't heard in 20 years. Something inside me flickered, not anger exactly, but something colder. A noticing, a memory standing up after years of sitting still. This wasn't the kind of family people dream of. This was the kind that teaches you to disappear quietly so someone else can shine loudly. But I was about to unlearn all of that. There was a ledger in my head, one I'd never spoken out loud. $8,000 for the cafe. $5,000 to cover Ryan's overdue credit cards. $200 for his failed marketing course. $800 in random emergencies, car repairs, rent a temporary stay at an Airbnb after a breakup. $28,000 over 4 years. That's what I'd given to my brother. I once joked to Emily that Ryan had taken more out of me than my college tuition had. She didn't laugh. That morning, she stood at the kitchen sink, hand resting on her belly, her other one tightening around her coffee mug. Caleb was outside playing, and I could tell she had waited until he was out of earshot to say it. Daniel. She began gently. We can't afford to keep being his rescue plan. We have Caleb, and we're about to have Sophie. We need to protect them now. I nodded but didn't respond. I felt the weight of history clinging to my silence. 3 days later, Ryan showed up. Same confident smile, same practiced enthusiasm, but this time his eyes had a glazed desperation, not hope. He dropped onto our couch, opened his laptop, and launched into a PowerPoint presentation titled Miller Transport Solutions. I've done my research, he said. Logistics is the next gold rush. Online orders, shipping delays, it's a mess out there. People are making millions, man. Emily leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. I didn't say anything. I just watched. I need $1,000, Ryan said. I've already got $25K saved. With your help, I can buy 2 trucks, hire drivers, and be up and running in 2 months. It was rehearsed. He was ready for yes. But I wasn't. Ryan, I said slowly, I can't do this. He blinked, laughed like maybe I was joking. I'm serious, I said. We've helped before more times than I can count. But this time, no. The room changed. Ryan's jaw tightened. You're doing fine, he snapped. You've got this house, your job, a wife who works part-time. What the hell are you even spending on? I stood up. I'm spending on a future that doesn't revolve around cleaning up your messes, he scoffed. You're unbelievable. You forgot what family means. No, I said, voice sharper now. I finally remembered what it doesn't mean. Ryan stormed past Emily, and slammed the front door so hard the picture frames rattled. That night I sat on the edge of Caleb's bed, watching him sleep, his little chest rising and falling like waves on a calm sea. I tucked his blanket tighter and whispered, You'll never have to beg for love. As I stepped out of the room, my phone buzzed. It was Elaine. She didn't say hello. You shamed your brother, she snapped. He came to you vulnerable, and you slammed the door in his face. I closed my eyes, pressed the phone tighter to my ear. Mom, I've helped Ryan for years. This wasn't a door slam, this was self-preservation. There was a pause, then her voice dropped to something more sinister. You've changed, she said. You used to be compassionate. Now you're just cold. I'm a father now, I replied. I have to be strong for the people who depend on me. She hung up. 2 hours later, Walter called. He rarely did. His voice was low and slow, like a loaded warning. You'll regret this, Daniel, he said. You've turned your back on your blood. That word blood hung in the air like a stain I couldn't wash out. Blood. What had it ever guaranteed me? I flashed back to being 14, pleading to join the school soccer team, only to be told it was a waste of time. I remembered Ryan's new guitar, then his private art tutor, then his expensive skateboard lessons, all given with pride. When I asked why the rules were different, Walter said, "You're the older one. You make sacrifices. He needs more." I had been trained to believe that my worth was in giving and his in receiving. But now I was no longer a son who needed approval. I was a man who had children of his own. That night, Emily found me in the garage, standing by the car in the dim light, fists clenched at my sides. She didn't say anything, just walked over, wrapped her arms around me from behind, and whispered, "You did the right thing." And for the first time, I believed her. Because in that moment, I wasn't a brother. I wasn't a son. I was a father who had finally chosen his own family. The morning Sophie was born started like any other, until it didn't. Emily had just stepped out of the shower when she gripped the doorframe face, contorted in pain. "It's time," she gasped. The hospital bag was already by the front door. As I loaded it into the car, my hands trembled, not from fear, but adrenaline. We were ready. We had waited. We had dreamed. Except one thing wasn't planned. Caleb needed to be picked up from school that afternoon. I grabbed my phone and called my parents. Walter answered on the second ring. "Dad, it's happening. I need someone to grab Caleb from school today. Can you—" "Of course," he said quickly. "You focus on Emily and the baby. We'll handle everything." His voice was steady, almost warm. For a second, I let myself believe we were back in safe territory. I hung up, kissed Emily's forehead, and whispered, "She's coming." Hours later, Sophie arrived, small, pink, healthy. The world felt still when I held her. Her fingers curled tightly around mine. I looked at Emily, exhausted but glowing, and felt an unfamiliar kind of peace. "She's perfect," I whispered. "We named her Sophia Rose. She had her mother's eyes." I called my parents again. "She's here," I said. "And she's safe. Thank you again for picking up Caleb. He's going to be so excited to meet her." Walter replied, "We'll bring him this evening." I never got that evening. At 6:12 p.m., I realized I hadn't heard from them. No updates, no messages, just silence. I called my mother, no answer. Then my father, nothing. Again and again. By the 14th call, my chest was tight, my mouth dry. Emily, now resting, noticed my pacing. "What's wrong?" she asked. "They're not answering," I said. "They were supposed to bring Caleb." Before she could respond, my phone rang. "Unknown number. Hello?" I answered, my voice caught halfway between panic and pleading. "Mr. Daniels," a calm voice asked. "This is Reverend Jennings from Gracewood Baptist. Are you the father of a boy named Caleb?" My stomach dropped. Yes, I'm his father." "What happened?" "We found him sitting alone in the back pew. He had a bracelet with your number. He's safe, but he's shaken up." What do you mean he was alone?" I asked, voice cracking. "The elderly couple who brought him, they left, told him to wait for you." I gripped the edge of the hospital bed. "I'm on my way." Emily's face had already gone pale. "What do you mean, left?" I kissed her forehead again. "I'll bring our son home." The drive to the church took 25 minutes. Each one felt like a lifetime. When I pulled up, Reverend Jennings stood at the door, looking just as shocked to see me as I was to be there. "He's inside," the Reverend said. "He's okay, just frightened." I stepped into the small church office and saw my son curled up on a worn couch holding his tattered stuffed giraffe. He looked up, eyes red-lipped, trembling, and whispered, "Daddy." I dropped to my knees and caught him in my arms. Grandma said, "You didn't love me anymore," he said. My heart shattered. "Never, Caleb. That's not true. You are my heart, my whole world. I will always love you." He sobbed against my shoulder. I held him tighter. Back at the hospital, I tucked Caleb into Emily's arms. Her tears flowed as freely as his. I kissed them both and said, "I need to do something. I'll be back." I drove straight to Walter and Elaine's house. I didn't knock gently. I pounded. Walter opened the door slowly as if expecting me. "How could you?" I asked, my voice shaking with rage. He didn't blink. "Now you understand what it feels like to be abandoned by someone you love." I stared at him, stunned. "You did it to your brother?" he added. "We just showed you the pain you caused." Elaine appeared behind him, arms crossed like this had been planned, like it was righteous. "He's your grandson," I snapped. "He's 6 years old. You left him in a church like he was disposable." "He was safe," Elaine said coldly. "People leave kids at churches all the time when they can't take care of them." "I can take care of him," I shouted. "I chose to protect him from this twisted game you're all playing. You didn't teach me a lesson. You proved you never saw me as anything but an extension of Ryan." Walter stepped closer. "Blood matters. And you chose strangers over your own." "I chose my child," I whispered. And I turned and walked away. In the rearview mirror, their porch light flickered off. That night I sat by Caleb's bed while he slept. Emily rocked Sophie, who whimpered softly in her arms. The house felt different, heavier, but clearer. Betrayal, I learned, doesn't always scream. Sometimes it shows up with a casserole, says we love you, and drives your son to a church with no intention of ever returning. But I also learned something else. Just because someone calls it family doesn't mean it is. The house was too quiet. Even with a newborn's occasional fuss and the soft lull of the baby monitor, there was an eerie stillness that hung between the walls like thick fog. Daniel sat on the edge of Caleb's bed, watching his son sleep restlessly. The little boy clutched his stuffed giraffe like it was his last safe place in the world. Every so often, Caleb twitched and whimpered in his sleep, his breath catching his legs pulling in. That night, Daniel didn't leave the room. He kept the nightlight on. At 2:38 a.m., Caleb bolted upright, crying. "No, don't leave me." Daniel reached for him instantly. "I'm right here, buddy. You're safe. You're safe." Tears soaked Caleb's pajamas as he buried his face into his father's chest. That's when Daniel knew no apology would undo this. No family meeting, no forgiveness dinner. Some betrayals don't get Band-Aids, they need boundaries. The next morning, Emily's parents arrived. Thomas, a retired electrical engineer with gentle eyes and a fierce moral compass, hugged his daughter and granddaughter with trembling hands. Linda, who had taught kindergarten for 30 years, scooped Caleb into her arms and whispered, "We love you so much. You are never alone again, sweetheart." Caleb didn't speak, he only nodded. Over breakfast, Daniel recounted the entire event, the abandonment, the confrontation, the silence. Thomas's face darkened with each detail. That wasn't misjudgment, that was cruelty. What kind of people weaponize a child to prove a point? Emily looked down at her coffee cup. "People who think love is earned through obedience." Daniel sat quietly before saying, "I've been trying to earn their love since I was 10. Linda reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "You don't have to anymore." Later that afternoon, Emily's old friend Jennifer Harper arrived. She walked in, wearing jeans, a blazer, and a fire in her eyes. Jennifer had been a family lawyer for nearly 20 years. She had seen emotional warfare and custody battles, but when she heard what happened to Caleb, she didn't flinch, she focused. "They abandoned your son during a medical emergency," she said, after Daniel told her everything. "And not by accident, but as punishment. That's child endangerment and emotional abuse. We'll build a case." Daniel hesitated. "They're still my parents." Jennifer leaned forward. "And Caleb is still your son. You can't be both protector and peacekeeper in a war they started." That night, Daniel sat on the couch with his journal open. The pages were scattered with years of quiet entries, lists of sacrifices, moments swallowed instead of spoken. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Maybe the only way to be a good father is to stop being the good son." When Caleb woke up screaming again, it was Daniel who ran to him whispering, "I'm not going anywhere." 3 days later, with Jennifer's guidance, Daniel officially filed charges against Walter and Elaine for child abandonment and emotional endangerment. The paperwork felt heavier than its weight. Not because he doubted it, but because it confirmed something permanent, that the people who raised him could no longer be trusted with the people he loved. Emily stood beside him as he handed over the signed documents. "You're not breaking the family," she whispered. "You're building a better one." Caleb spent the next few nights sleeping in their bed. He didn't ask for stories or songs, he just needed to hear. Breathing, feel skin, and know that when he opened his eyes, they'd still be there. Emily nursed Sophia with one arm and stroked Caleb's hair with the other. Thomas and Linda brought warm meals, stayed the night on a blow-up mattress, and read Caleb picture books about families that looked nothing like his. When Linda read the family book, a story that celebrates adoption, grandparents, single moms, and blended homes, Caleb pointed to the page with families that are not always related but love each other just the same. He looked up and said, "That's us, right?" Linda kissed his forehead. "That's us." "Exactly." The house, while still tender and quiet, slowly began to breathe again. Daniel started taking walks with Caleb in the morning, holding his tiny hand as they wandered the sidewalk, sometimes talking, sometimes silent. Emily rested with Sophia, more leaning into the softness of maternity leave and the quiet sanctuary they were rebuilding. One night, while watching Caleb help Linda water the front garden, Thomas walked up beside Daniel and said, "You did the right thing." "I know," Daniel replied, "but it still hurts." Thomas nodded. "That's what real change feels like." Daniel smiled faintly. "I always thought being a man meant staying loyal to family no matter what." "No," Thomas said. "Being a man means knowing when to build a new one." There was a moment just before the hearing when Daniel stood at the bathroom sink, gripping its edge like it might float away. The cold porcelain grounded him. He looked into the mirror, not at his face, but into his eyes. For the first time in months, he didn't look like a man torn between being a father and being a son. He looked like someone who had chosen. The weeks leading up to court were filled with quiet preparation. Jennifer Harper, unshakable, in her purpose, worked long hours gathering evidence. She interviewed Reverend Jennings, who recalled in haunting detail how he found Caleb alone in the church lobby, shaking, crying, clutching a stuffed giraffe. "We don't usually find abandoned children in pews," the Reverend said solemnly. He kept asking if his daddy still loved him. They also pulled security footage from the church's front camera. In the grainy video, Elaine and Walter are seen walking Caleb to the steps and leaving without saying a word to anyone. In the final seconds, Caleb runs after the car, arms outstretched, and the car doesn't stop. Jennifer gathered therapy notes from Caleb's sessions. His therapist described signs of acute separation anxiety, recurring nightmares, withdrawal, and clinging to Daniel at school drop-off. Still, through all of it, the boy found flickers of joy again. One spring afternoon, Thomas held the back of Caleb's small bike, jogging behind as the training wheels had finally come off. With each pass down the driveway, Caleb's laughter grew louder. Daniel watched from the porch, hand over his heart, whispering thanks into the wind. The morning of the court hearing arrived with cool, overcast skies. The courtroom smelled of old wood and cold air. Daniel sat between Jennifer and Thomas Emily, just behind them, with baby Sophie nestled in a sling across her chest. Across the room sat Walter and Elaine. Walter's jaw was tight. Elaine wore pearls. Neither of them looked in Daniel's direction. Judge Roberta Hayes presided, a woman known for her calm demeanor and low tolerance for emotional manipulation. She read the charges with crisp formality: child abandonment, emotional endangerment, and misuse of guardianship authority during a medical emergency. Jennifer began with her opening statement. "Your Honor, we are not here because of a misunderstanding. We are here because two adults used a 6-year-old child to punish his father for choosing financial responsibility over toxic obedience. This is not just about hurt feelings. This is about harm." Elaine was the first to testify. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. Her voice was measured, rehearsed. "We didn't abandon Caleb," she said. "We left him somewhere safe. It was meant to be a lesson. Families stick together. We wanted our son to understand that." Jennifer remained stone-faced. So your lesson involved leaving a child with strangers and making him believe his parents didn't love him? Elaine hesitated. We thought he'd be fine. Then came the surveillance footage. The room fell silent as the grainy image of Caleb running sobbing filled the screen. Someone in the gallery audibly gasped. Daniel looked down. He'd seen it before, but not like this. Not surrounded by walls and silence and law. Walter wouldn't make eye contact with the screen. Then Daniel took the stand. He spoke with calm, not rage. My parents taught me about responsibility. They taught me about pride, about showing up. But somewhere along the way, they started believing that love had to be earned. That if I didn't bend to their version of loyalty, I deserved punishment. My son is not a pawn. He is a child. And I won't let anyone family or not use him to settle scores. When he stepped down, Emily quietly reached for his hand and squeezed. Jennifer's final words rang clear. Justice here doesn't look like revenge. It looks like accountability. After a short recess, Judge Hayes returned and delivered the verdict. The court finds Walter and Elaine Freeman guilty of reckless child endangerment and emotional harm. Each defendant is sentenced to 18 months of probation, fined $15,000, and prohibited from contact with Caleb Freeman for a minimum of 3 years. She paused, looking directly at Walter and Elaine. You do not get to redefine abandonment to suit your guilt. You do not get to use a child's love as leverage, and you do not get to hurt people in the name of family. As the gavel came down, Daniel let out a long, quiet breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the church call. Not triumph, not revenge, just the stillness of a father who had kept his child safe. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, but Daniel didn't speak to them. He just held Caleb's small hand in one of his and Emily's in the other. The three of them walked toward the car, one step into the next chapter. There would still be healing to do, still questions to answer, but for now justice had spoken not in fury, but in clarity. The voicemail came on a Tuesday morning. Elaine's voice, tired and restrained, trembled through the phone. Daniel, please. I didn't think it would end like this. We miss Caleb, we miss you. We were trying to teach you something. Please call me back. Daniel listened. And then, without anger or hesitation, he deleted the message. He didn't save it for proof. He didn't replay it. He just let it go like a paper lantern drifting down river. He had spent too long holding on to a version of his parents that no longer existed. The silence that followed felt merciful. 2 weeks after the court ruling, Ryan showed up at Daniel's door. No business pitch this time. No smirk. Just a man who looked like he'd slept in his car, face hollowed by regret. I need to say this, Ryan began, voice low, cracking. I never imagined they'd hurt him. I complained to them, I vented. But I didn't mean for Caleb to be used like that. Daniel didn't interrupt. He stood still in the doorway, the screen door between them like a line in the sand. I've been trying to clean up my life, Ryan continued. I got a steady job, started paying back the money. But when I saw what they did to your boy, his voice caught. I'm sorry, Dan. Truly. Daniel opened the door not all the way, but enough. I forgive you, he said. But forgiveness isn't forgetting, and it's not a free pass back into my life. Ryan nodded. I get that. They stood there for a moment, two brothers, no longer boys, no longer tangled in childhood roles. The air between them was thick with truth, but it was finally breathable. Later that evening, Emily sat on the floor with Caleb helping him sort his colored pencils. The room was quiet, except for the scratch of wax on paper. Caleb was drawing. A house with a wide front porch, a tree swing, and 5 people standing outside. Who's this one? Emily asked, pointing to a gray-haired woman in glasses. That's Grandma Linda, Caleb said proudly. And that's Grandpa Thomas. That's you and Daddy and me. Emily paused. What about Grandma Elaine and Grandpa Walter? Caleb looked up thoughtful, then turned back to his picture. They're not in this one, he said simply. They don't come to my house anymore. Emily didn't push. She just kissed the top of his head and whispered, This is a beautiful family, Caleb. Therapy sessions began a week later. Caleb's therapist, Dr. Marissa Blake, had soft brown eyes and a voice like warm oatmeal. In their first meeting, she asked Caleb to build a feelings house using toys and blocks. He placed Daniel as the front door. Emily was the roof. Linda and Thomas were the lights. "And what about this piece?" Dr. Blake asked, holding up a tiny chair. Caleb placed it outside, near a plastic tree. "That's the chair for people who are sorry," he said. "But they have to stay outside until it's okay." Daniel blinked back tears. The boy was healing. Meanwhile, Emily scaled back her shifts at the hospital. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to be present. "We can rebuild the money," she said, but not his trust. Their days became gentler. Morning walks, pancake breakfasts, bedtime stories. Not to erase what happened, but to layer it with love so the cracks wouldn't widen. On Sundays, they visited Thomas and Linda, who had become more than in-laws. They were anchors. At one dinner, Thomas built a birdhouse with Caleb, showing him how to hammer without splitting the wood. "You always go slow at first," he said. "That's how you stay steady." Daniel watched from the window, holding baby Sophie in his arms. He wasn't bitter, just clear. He no longer measured love by shared blood, but by who showed up when it mattered. And Thomas and Linda never missed a moment. One afternoon, Daniel returned to his journal, a habit he'd let slip. He opened to a blank page and wrote, "Letting go doesn't mean I don't care. It means I won't carry what isn't mine anymore. I am not responsible for the wounds that built my parents. I am responsible for not passing them down." He closed the book and exhaled. They weren't fully healed yet. But they were safe, they were honest, and they were home. The quiet returned slowly. Not all at once, not with a sudden peace, but in gentle rhythms, the way Sophie cooed, when Emily hummed to her, the soft flicker of candles at dinner, the sound of Caleb's laughter echoing from the backyard as Thomas showed him how to hold a watering can just right. "You don't pour too fast," Thomas said, crouched beside him, his hand guiding Caleb's. "Plants are a lot like people. They grow when you're patient." Caleb nodded, then looked up at his grandfather. "Like me?" "Exactly like you." In the evenings, Linda would sit with him by the fire and read stories. Her voice, warm and melodic, became Caleb's favorite sound before bed. One night he leaned into her and whispered, "Grandma, you read better than the library lady." Linda laughed and kissed his forehead. "That's because I read with love." Life wasn't perfect, but it was whole. Daniel stood in the doorway most nights, watching his family settle into this new chapter. Sophie had begun to smile, those gummy, soul-deep grins that made time stop. She had Emily's eyes and Daniel's stubborn little frown when she was sleepy. Caleb adored her. He'd peek into her bassinet and say, "Hey, baby, guess what? I watered the sunflowers today." Emily, meanwhile, had quietly launched an online group, Roots and Wings, a space for parents healing from generational trauma. Each week she shared short reflections, encouraged journaling, and offered gentle, practical support. One post read, "Forgiveness isn't a door you hold open forever. Sometimes it's a boundary, sometimes it's silence, but always it should be healing." The comments poured in. Strangers who had never dared speak of their own stories, women who had stayed too long in roles that required self-erasure, men learning how to be fathers without repeating the patterns they inherited. And week after week, Emily showed up not as a savior, but as a mirror. Daniel watched her work and felt a quiet pride swell in his chest. She wasn't just surviving, she was lighting the way for others. One afternoon, Ryan showed up again, not to talk, not to linger, but to hand Daniel a check. "First payment," he said. $500, just like I promised." Daniel nodded and took the envelope. "Thanks. I know it's a long way to go," Ryan added, "but I'll pay it all, even if it takes years." Daniel believed him not because Ryan had changed entirely, but because he was finally choosing responsibility over excuses. That night, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, opened the check, and moved the money into a new savings account. The name on the account, Caleb Morrison. College fund. Emily peeked over his shoulder. You're using Ryan's payments for Caleb. Daniel nodded. Feels right. We're planting something better with it. She smiled, kissed his cheek. You always know how to turn ashes into soil. Later, after the house had quieted, Daniel opened his journal again. I used to think brokenness meant failure, but now I see what they broke, we rebuilt. Stronger. My son will know what safety feels like, my daughter will never question if she's loved, and my wife, she will never carry this burden alone. He closed the book and pressed his hand to its cover as if sealing something sacred. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, rustling the sunflowers Caleb had planted. And somewhere in that breeze, Daniel felt it not forgiveness for the pain, but gratitude for the path forward. The family he was born into had taught him what not to be. The family he built taught him everything else. The auditorium was packed. Parents leaned forward in their seats, cameras ready, the hum of anticipation thick in the spring air. It was Hero Day at Westbrook Elementary, where second graders shared who taught them the most important lesson in their young lives. Caleb stood near the edge of the stage, small but steady, his hair neatly combed and his shoelaces triple-tied the way he liked them. Daniel sat in the second row, knees bouncing. Emily reached over and gently pressed his hand. He'll be amazing, she whispered. When Caleb stepped up to the mic, the room hushed. My Grandpa Thomas taught me how to ride a bike. Caleb began, his voice clear. He said to keep going even if you fall once or twice. A ripple of smiles moved through the crowd. Then Caleb looked straight ahead. But my dad taught me how to protect people. Even when it's scary. Even when people say you should stay quiet. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He told me a good man keeps people safe, especially the ones who can't protect themselves, like little sisters. The audience clapped, touched, but Daniel wasn't listening to them. His eyes were locked on his son, this boy who had been so afraid, so shaken just a year before, now standing tall, brave, whole. When the applause faded and the kids filed off stage, Daniel turned his face, slightly wiping a tear that had snuck down his cheek. Emily saw and leaned in. We did the right thing, she said, squeezing his arm. Daniel nodded but couldn't speak just yet. That evening they ate dinner in the backyard. The sun was low and golden, casting everything in warm light. Sophie sat in the grass with a plastic shovel, chattering to herself as she filled a bucket. Caleb chased fireflies, laughing arms outstretched like wings. Emily brought out 2 mugs of tea and sat beside Daniel on the back steps. They're happy, she said. They're safe, he replied. The two sat in silence, soaking in the sounds of small joy, Sophie giggling, Caleb calling out, Look, I caught one! The air smelled like honeysuckle and hope. Daniel looked around the yard, the same one where a year ago he had stood alone, broken-hearted after confronting his parents. The same yard where Emily had held his hand through tears, where Thomas had planted the garden, and where Linda had once wrapped her arms around Caleb and said, You'll never be unloved again. A home rebuilt not just with wood and furniture, but with presence, with promises kept. He looked at his son and daughter, then into Emily's eyes. They left him, Daniel said softly. Emily turned, but he was never alone. Daniel nodded. Not while I was breathing. A few days later, Daniel journaled again. His final entry on this chapter of his life. I don't know if legacy is built in blood. I think it's built in moments. A bike ride, a bedtime story. Saying no to what breaks you even when it's your own kin. I used to be afraid to disappoint them. Now I'm only afraid of disappointing the little boy who looks to me and calls me Dad. My job isn't to continue the story I came from. My job is to write a better one. That night, Daniel tucked Caleb into bed. Sophie was already asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling like waves. As he pulled the blanket over Caleb, the boy whispered, You're my hero, Dad. Daniel kissed his forehead. You're mine, too. He walked outside and stood in the yard. The stars were beginning to show. The final voiceover, like a quiet truth spoken into the night, they left him. But he was never alone. Not while I was breathing. And then the last line written perhaps for every parent afraid of becoming what they came from. Sometimes love begins the moment you decide not to repeat the story you were born into.